Oops, I accidentally backed into your car, my sister said with a smug smile, right after I refused to cosign her loan. Mom shrugged. It's just a dent. Don't start drama. I didn't argue. That evening, I opened one file, made one phone call, and went to bed. At 7:03 a.m., my sister ran outside, screaming her car was gone. The repo team had arrived. Turns out that loan she wanted, I'd already been the guarantor once before. Not this time. You know that feeling when you realize everything you thought was true about your family was a lie? When the people who are supposed to have your back are actually the ones holding the knife. That's exactly where I found myself, utterly blindsided, but determined that I wouldn't let them get away with it anymore. My name is Elias, I'm 29, and until a few months ago, I still believed the myth that blood runs thicker than water. I should have known better. Growing up, my parents treated my sister, Delilah, like she was royalty, graceful, deserving, too delicate to ever face consequences. Me? I was the one always told to be understanding every time she borrowed something that wasn't hers or left a mess I had to clean up. Delilah was 3 years younger, but she quickly mastered the art of the well-timed pout. One little quiver of her lip, and any wrongdoing vanished. If I even looked at her wrong, I was a bully. If she took my things without asking, I was selfish for wanting them back. It was exhausting. I thought moving into my own apartment, putting some distance between us, would finally bring me peace. I was wrong. That peace shattered one overcast Tuesday in April. For a week, Delilah had been calling me nonstop, and I'd been dodging every single one. I knew what she wanted. Her social media was plastered with photos of her test driving a brand new luxury SUV, despite the fact she could barely afford her one-bedroom apartment. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. She wanted a cosigner. Sure enough, she finally cornered me at our parents' place during Sunday dinner. Phone in hand, screen glowing with financing terms. Eli, it's basically free money, she purred, her voice sickly sweet, as if she was doing me the favor. I just need you to sign, and I'll take care of the rest. I didn't even bother with a lecture. No, I said, plain and steady, and went back to sipping my coffee. The shift in her face was immediate, almost violent, like a mask cracking. Her smile twitched, then hardened into something sharp and ugly. Wow, she muttered, I guess family loyalty means nothing to you. Mom, of course, jumped in with her usual chorus. Eli, it's just paperwork. She's your sister. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Dad, as always, stayed silent, which in our family was a full endorsement of whatever Mom and Delilah wanted. But I held my ground. I left not long after. The next day, I found out exactly how Delilah handles disappointment. I was walking out of my building's lobby, keys in hand, when I saw her standing by the curb, phone pressed to her ear. I almost didn't recognize my own car. It was parked a little crooked, with a fresh, fist-sized dent in the rear bumper. Before I could even speak, she ended her call and turned toward me with that smile. The one she used when she knew she'd won. Oops, she said lightly, twirling her keys. I accidentally backed into your car. My bad. I just stared at her. You what? It's not a big deal, she continued, shrugging. Insurance will cover it. Maybe you shouldn't have parked so close to the driveway. She wasn't even trying to sound apologetic. She was enjoying herself. I glanced at the dent. Fresh paint chipped, metal slightly bent. You did this on purpose, I said quietly. Her smirk told me everything I needed to know. Just then, Mom pulled up, stepping out with a grocery bag. She glanced at the bumper and waved her hand dismissively. It's just a dent, Elias. Cars get scratched. Don't make a federal case out of it. She said it like she was already tired of the conversation, as if I was being unreasonable for caring about my own property. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even tell them what I was really thinking. Instead, I stood there watching Delilah saunter back to her beat-up sedan, cracked taillight and all, and pull away. The satisfaction on her face burned into my mind. That evening, after my apartment was quiet and the city outside my window settled into its usual hum, I pulled out a folder from my desk drawer. Inside was a document I'd kept for years, one I never thought I'd need, but held on to just in case. I read it over twice, the words lining up in my head with the conversation I'd overheard at Sunday dinner. A plan began to take shape. Then I made one phone call. It was short, under 2 minutes, but enough to set things in motion. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept picturing Delilah's smug expression, the way Mom had brushed it all aside. They thought I'd swallow it, like I always had. But they didn't know I wasn't the same Elias anymore. I'd learned to be patient. I'd learned to keep my moves quiet until the right moment. And at 7:03 a.m. the next morning, Delilah learned that too. I'll tell you exactly what happened. But first, you need to understand, this wasn't just about a dent in my car. Delilah's little oops might have been the spark, but the gasoline had been collecting for years. The dent was just a symbol, something tangible I could point to. The real damage was in all the little ways she'd been given a free pass, while I was told to be the bigger person. I started thinking back to every time she'd walked away unscathed from something that would have had me grounded for weeks. Like in high school, when she borrowed Mom's credit card to buy a $400 designer bag and blamed me when the bill came. Mom believed her without hesitation, and I spent that weekend repainting the kitchen as punishment. Or the summer after she graduated college, when she moved into my apartment temporarily while job hunting, and somehow my rent went up because she never paid her share of utilities. Every time I tried to hold her accountable, it became an attack on her character, proof that I was too hard on her. So, after the dent incident, I didn't confront her right away. I knew better. When I'd fight back openly, they'd all close ranks to protect her. This time, I stayed quiet and observed. And it didn't take long for her to give me more ammunition. A few days later, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some tax papers for Dad. I hadn't even taken my shoes off when I heard voices in the kitchen. Delilah's was unmistakable, loud, indignant, dripping with self-pity. And Elias wouldn't even help me with the loan. Can you believe that? He's always acting like he's better than everyone else now just because he's got that good job. Mom's voice floated back, warm and syrupy. Honey, some people forget where they came from. Don't let it bother you. You'll get that car somehow. Maybe we can all pitch in. Instead, Mom called me twice, both times to scold me. You're taking this way too far, she said during the first call. Your sister made a mistake, but she's family. You don't just cut people off over money. It's not just money, I told her. It's trust. And she knew exactly what she was doing. She's under stress, Mom countered, her voice taking on that clipped, patronizing edge she used when she wanted me to stop arguing. She needs compassion right now, not punishment. I didn't respond to that one. There was no point. The second call was worse. Mom said she and Dad had been talking things over and decided that if I wasn't going to let this go, then maybe it was better if I didn't come to family dinners for a while. Not to punish me, she claimed, but to ease the tension. Translation, it was easier to sideline me than to hold Delilah accountable. That was the moment it hit me. Really hit me deep down, that they weren't just blind to her behavior. They were active participants in enabling it. It wasn't Delilah against me. It was Delilah and the family unit, and I was the outsider. The crushing weight of that realization sank deep. I stopped answering their calls. I worked longer hours, stayed out later. My apartment became a place of silence I wasn't sure I liked. Friends noticed I was quieter, but I brushed it off. How do you explain to someone that your own parents see you as expendable so long as it keeps the family peace? One night, about a week after the confrontation, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a note in Delilah's handwriting. You're overreacting. It's just money. I'll pay you back when I can. Don't make things ugly. No apology, no accountability, just an expectation that I'd eventually fold. I sat on my couch for a long time. That note on the coffee table in front of me, the city lights blinking through the window. This was my rock bottom. Not the dent, not the fraud attempt, but the sheer clarity that nothing I said or did would ever change their dynamic. They weren't going to wake up one day and see how unfair this was. The only thing I could control was how I responded. And so, quietly, I began to pull away. I stopped sharing any personal details. I unfollowed them on social media so I wouldn't have to see Delilah's smug posts. I told my landlord to deny entry to anyone who wasn't me. Every loose thread of my life that Delilah could tug on, I started securing. But I wasn't just retreating. In the background, that folder in my desk was still there, and the number I'd called a week earlier was still saved in my phone. I started adding to it dates, names, little details I'd overheard or remembered from past conversations. I wasn't rushing. I wanted precision, not impulse. They thought they'd push me into a corner. They thought I'd lick my wounds quietly until I came crawling back. What they didn't realize was that I'd stopped playing their game altogether. I was building my own, and when it was ready, they wouldn't see it coming. And then one evening, while reviewing a seemingly minor detail in that folder, I realized I had something far bigger than I'd initially thought, something that could turn the tide completely. It's strange how fast the fog lifts once you stop waiting for people to treat you better. The more distance I put between myself and my family, the clearer my head became, and the more energy I had to put into my own life. At work, I started volunteering for projects I used to avoid, mostly because I was too mentally drained dealing with family drama. I stayed late when it mattered, took on responsibilities outside my job description, and within 2 months, my boss asked me into his office. I braced myself for bad news, but instead he slid a paper across the desk, a promotion offer. The pay bump was bigger than I'd expected, and the title came with authority I'd never had before. I signed before he could change his mind. That extra income didn't go to flash or impulse. I was careful. I increased my investments, paid off the last of my student loans, and opened a separate savings account labeled Future Projects. There was something empowering about knowing that every dollar I earned was mine alone, untouched by the constant drain of helping out a sister who saw my wallet as a family resource. Socially, things shifted too. I started saying yes to more invitations from friends. We took weekend trips, tried new restaurants, even went hiking, a hobby I'd never considered before, but quickly grew to love. My circle became people who added to my life instead of taking from it. Nobody was keeping score. Nobody was guilting me into doing things I didn't want to do. Meanwhile, Delilah's little stunts didn't stop, but they started to look smaller. I heard from a cousin that she'd been denied financing on that luxury SUV she wanted, and that her current car had broken down twice in 1 month. Another relative mentioned she'd been venting online about toxic siblings and how she was surrounded by people who don't want her to succeed. It didn't bother me anymore. It just confirmed what I already knew. But I wasn't just moving on. I was positioning myself. That folder in my desk was no longer just a precaution. It was a blueprint. Over time, I gathered every receipt, message, and piece of evidence that painted the full picture of Delilah's entitlement. From the dented bumper to the fraud attempt, I also had something she didn't know about, a legal connection between her and a piece of property she thought was in someone else's name entirely. That was the part that had started as a faint detail in my memory and turned into something substantial once I dug deeper. A connection that, if used correctly, could flip her world upside down, not out of spite, but to finally make her understand what it feels like when someone else holds the cards. By late summer, I was no longer in survival mode. I was thriving. My savings were growing faster than ever. My career trajectory was steep, and my confidence, both in myself and in my ability to handle what came next, was unshakable. Every time I saw Delilah's name pop up on my phone, I didn't feel dread anymore. I felt readiness. And then, in early September, I got a call from someone who unknowingly gave me exactly the last piece I needed. They didn't know they were handing me the key to the whole plan, but when I hung up, I knew the timing was perfect. The call came from Mr. Halverson, my late grandfather's attorney. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the will had been settled, but his voice was exactly as I remembered, measured, deliberate, never wasting a word. "Elias," he began, "I thought you should know about a matter that's recently come across my desk. Your grandfather's old property on Hawthorne Street. Do you recall it?" I did. A 2-story brick building near downtown. It had sat empty for years after Grandpa passed, and I assumed it had been sold or passed to someone else in the family. "Well," Halverson continued, "it appears your sister's name is still attached to the title. It was part of an arrangement your grandfather made. Something about helping her start fresh when she came of age, but she never followed through on the conditions. Legally, that means the property reverts to you as his next eligible heir. We're finalizing the transfer now unless you wish to contest it. I sat there, the weight of his words settling in like a stone dropping into deep water. Not only was this property valuable, prime location, no mortgage, but Delilah clearly didn't know she no longer had any real claim to it. If she'd been aware, she would have bragged about it years ago. Halverson sent me the paperwork, and by the end of the week, the deed was in my name. Just like that, I owned something my sister thought was hers by right. But that wasn't all. In the days that followed, I quietly started looking into the property's history. Through public records and a friend in real estate, I discovered Delilah had been using the building's address for certain business ventures, small online shops, pop-up events, and even a couple of questionable credit applications. Nothing illegal on paper, but enough to make me wonder if she'd been using the property as a kind of phantom asset to boost her image. Now, with me as the legal owner, I had the power to shut all of that down in one move. But I didn't rush it. I wanted to time this right. Not just for maximum effect, but so there'd be no way for her to spin it as me being petty. I needed the setup to be airtight. At the same time, my position at work had given me another advantage. The promotion I'd earned came with connections to people in finance, law, and property management. Exactly the kind of people who could help me navigate the next phase without a single misstep. Over coffee and after-hours conversations, I learned exactly how to leverage ownership of the Hawthorne property without ever setting foot inside it. And in one particularly enlightening chat, a colleague mentioned a legal mechanism that could effectively freeze any operations tied to the building until certain fees were paid and permits cleared. Fees and permits that would now require my signature as owner. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. I had control of an asset my sister valued. I had documentation tying her to it in ways she'd rather keep quiet. And I had the professional network to execute this cleanly. All I needed was an event, a moment when she'd be most exposed, most certain of her own untouchable position, before I flipped the board. That opportunity came faster than I expected, in the form of a glossy, gold-embossed invitation slipped into my mailbox one Friday evening. The invitation was for the Hawthorne Launch Gala, a catered, champagne-filled event to celebrate Delilah's new business venture inside the very property I now owned. The card was printed on thick, expensive paper, with her name front and center in looping gold script. I almost laughed when I read the tagline, "A bold new chapter, the city's next hotspot." It didn't take much to see what she was doing. She'd probably told everyone she owned the place, framing it as her grand achievement. She was going to use this gala to cement her image as an ambitious, self-made entrepreneur. The guest list, which I got a peek at from a mutual friend, was full of local business owners, distant relatives, and a couple of minor social media influencers. She must have begged to attend. She had no idea I was the legal owner. That week, I set my plan in motion. First, I called my attorney, not Halverson, but someone from my own circle at work, to draft a formal notice revoking permission for any events on the property without my approval. It cited zoning issues, unpaid usage fees, and a pending review of all business activities tied to the building's address. The notice was perfectly legitimate and airtight. It also stated that due to these issues, the property would be locked down until further notice. Next, I hired a locksmith and a property manager I trusted. 2 days before the event, the locks were changed and a crisp notice of closure was posted on both the front and side doors. The notice was printed on official letterhead, with my name as the owner at the bottom in clean black ink. I didn't stop there. The morning of the gala, I had my attorney email Delilah directly, copying the event coordinator and catering service, informing them that the property was unavailable for use that evening and that any unauthorized access would be considered trespassing. The email included the legal references to back it up. I knew Delilah well enough to predict her reaction. She'd assume it was some kind of bureaucratic mix-up and try to push ahead anyway. Which is why at 6:45 p.m., I drove past the building and parked down the block. From where I sat, I could see guests arriving in dresses and suits, chattering as they stepped up to the locked glass doors. They rattled the handles, knocked, peered inside, and were greeted by empty, dimly lit rooms. No tables, no music, no catering setup, just the stark reflection of the closure notice in the glass. Delilah arrived shortly after, stepping out of a rideshare in a sparkling, floor-length gown. I watched as she stopped dead in her tracks, clutching a silver clutch bag. She hurried to the door, tugged at it, then pulled out her phone, pacing in her heels. A few guests tried asking her what was going on, but she just shook her head, waving them off. Then, like clockwork, the catering van pulled up, and the driver handed her a printed copy of the attorney's email, which I'd made sure they received. I couldn't hear her from where I sat, but I saw the way her jaw tightened, her smile flickered, and her shoulders slumped. Word spread quickly among the guests. Some left quietly, others lingered just long enough to post on social media about the strangest event cancellation ever. By 7:30, the sidewalk was nearly empty except for Delilah, standing alone under the streetlight, scrolling furiously on her phone. She didn't call me that night. But the next morning, I woke up to a barrage of texts. First from her, then from Mom, then from a couple of aunts who'd apparently heard a very one-sided version of events. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The deed, the notices, and the paper trail spoke for themselves. For the first time, Delilah had been forced to face consequences she couldn't laugh off or talk her way out of. And she knew exactly who had pulled the strings, without me ever having to raise my voice or make a scene. But the real fallout came in the days after, when the image she'd been building for years began to unravel, piece by piece. The days that followed were like watching a slow-motion collapse. By Monday morning, word had spread beyond the gala guests. Photos of the locked doors and the closure notice, my name clearly visible, circulated on local social media pages. Comments ranged from confused to openly mocking. Guess the grand opening didn't go as planned. Didn't she say she owned the place? Awkward. Her so-called business partners began quietly pulling away. The catering company demanded reimbursement for the wasted evening. The event coordinator sent her an invoice for last-minute cancellations. The influencers she'd bragged about inviting never mentioned her again. The image she'd been cultivating for months, glamorous, successful, untouchable, was suddenly riddled with cracks. But the real damage came when my attorney followed through with the rest of the process. Because she'd been using the Hawthorne property address for her side ventures, every permit and registration tied to it was now flagged for review. A few were outright revoked. Her online store went temporarily unavailable. A boutique pop-up she planned for the holidays had to be scrapped entirely. Mom called me 3 times that week, each voicemail angrier than the last. "You've humiliated your sister in front of the whole family," she snapped in one message. This was unnecessary, Elias. Completely unnecessary. I didn't call her back. Dad sent one text. Could we have handled this differently? I didn't answer that either. Delilah, though, she finally broke her silence in the form of a long, rambling message that started with, "I can't believe you did this to me," and ended with, "You've ruined everything." I read it once, calmly, and deleted it without replying. There was nothing to say. The next time I saw her was at a distant cousin's birthday lunch 2 months later. She arrived late, dressed plainly, no entourage, no designer accessories. She didn't meet my eyes once. The energy around her was different, muted, diminished. A few relatives still whispered about what happened, but nobody asked me directly. They didn't need to. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub it in. I just enjoyed my meal, chatted with the people who treated me with respect, and left early, walking out into the crisp air with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had finally tipped the balance. For years, they'd told me to be the bigger person while I took every hit in silence. This time, I was the bigger person, but on my own terms. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose my temper. I simply shifted the weight of her actions back onto her shoulders and let gravity do the rest. As I closed my car door and started the engine, I caught one last glimpse of her through the restaurant window, alone at the table, staring down at her phone. For the first time, she wasn't smiling. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just won. I'd taken back the one thing she could never touch again, my peace.